just moved into a new apartment, a small but cozy place in an old building downtown. It was perfect for me, a one-bedroom unit with just enough space to feel comfortable, but not cramped. The only thing that seemed out of place was the large, antique mirror that hung in the hallway. The mirror was ornate, with a gilded frame that looked like it had been there for decades. The glass itself was slightly warped, giving reflections a distorted, almost eerie quality. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, the building was old, and the mirror was probably just another antique left behind by a previous tenant. But as the days went by, I started to notice strange things. Every time I walked past the mirror, I would catch a glimpse of something that didn't quite belong. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. But soon, it became more distinct, a shape, like a person, standing just out of view. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination, but the figure became clearer with each passing day. It was always there, lurking in the background of my reflection, watching me as I moved through the hallway. The figure was tall and dark, with no discernible features, just a shadowy outline that seemed to pulse with an ominous energy. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I decided to take a closer look. I stood in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection, trying to see the figure more clearly. For a moment, everything seemed normal, just my reflection, slightly distorted by the old glass. But then, the figure appeared, standing directly behind me. I spun around, but the hallway was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. My heart was racing, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my forehead. I knew what I had seen, but I didn't want to believe it. The next few nights were filled with restless sleep and a growing sense of dread. I avoided the mirror as much as possible, but the figure seemed to be growing stronger, more present. I could feel its eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking at the mirror, and the air in the apartment felt heavy, oppressive. I decided to do some research on the building, hoping to find an explanation for what I was experiencing. I visited the local library and searched through old records and newspapers. That's when I discovered the story of the mirror. According to the records, the mirror had been in the building for over a century. It had once belonged to a woman who lived in the apartment many years ago. The woman was said to be deeply unhappy, plagued by loneliness and despair. She spent hours in front of the mirror, talking to her reflection, as if it were a living person. Neighbors reported hearing her conversations, though she lived alone. One night, the woman was found dead in front of the mirror, her expression frozen in terror. The cause of death was never determined, but locals believed that the mirror had somehow trapped her spirit, and that she still haunted the reflection, searching for a way out. I returned to my apartment, feeling a mixture of fear and unease. The figure in the mirror wasn't just a figment of my imagination, it was the spirit of the woman, trapped in the glass, watching me, waiting for something. I knew I had to get rid of the mirror, but I was terrified of what might happen if I did. The idea of facing the spirit directly, of provoking whatever was in the mirror, filled me with dread. But I couldn't live with the constant fear and the feeling of being watched. That night, I decided to confront the spirit. I stood in front of the mirror, holding a hammer, my hands shaking. I stared into the glass, and the figure appeared again, clearer than ever before. It was right behind me, so close I could almost feel its presence. With all the strength I could muster, I swung the hammer at the mirror. The glass shattered, sending shards flying across the hallway. For a moment, there was silence, and then a cold gust of wind swept through the apartment, extinguishing the lights. I stood there in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. When the lights flickered back on, the mirror was gone, just a broken frame hanging on the wall. The figure had disappeared, and the oppressive feeling that had hung over the apartment was gone. But as I cleaned up the shards of glass, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been released, something that had been trapped in the mirror for far too long. I never found out what happened to the woman's spirit, or where it went after the mirror was destroyed. But I couldn't help but wonder if I had made a mistake, if, in breaking the mirror, I had set something free that should have remained imprisoned. After that night, I moved out of the apartment, leaving the broken mirror behind. I never looked back, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel that same cold wind, and I wonder if the spirit is still out there, searching for a new reflection to haunt. The mysterious footsteps. I had always been a night owl, preferring the quiet solitude of the late hours to the hustle and bustle of the day. My apartment was on the top floor of an old building, and I loved the peace it offered. The streets outside were usually deserted by midnight, and the only sounds were the occasional car passing by or the distant murmur of the city. But one night, something changed. It started with a soft creaking, like the sound of someone slowly walking down a hallway. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, as old buildings often do. But the sound grew louder, more distinct, and I realized it was coming from the floor above me. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. The top floor was the attic, and it was supposed to be empty. I had lived in the building for years and had never heard anyone up there before. But the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sound was too real, too close. It didn't make sense, and the more I listened, the more unnerved I became. I got up from my desk and stood in the middle of my apartment, straining to hear where the footsteps were coming from. They seemed to be right above me, in the attic space that was directly over my bedroom. I felt a chill run down my spine as the footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Then, they started again, moving towards the far end of the attic. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the hallway. The door to the attic was at the end of the corridor, just a few feet from my apartment door. I hesitated for a moment, listening to the footsteps, which had now stopped again, as if waiting for me to make a move. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. The stairs leading up to the attic were dark, and the air felt colder than the rest of the building. I shone my flashlight up the stairs, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached the top. The attic was empty. The space was filled with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs, but there was no sign of anyone there. The air was thick with a smell of decay and something else, something metallic. I shivered, but I pressed on, shining my flashlight around the room. The footsteps had stopped as soon as I entered, and the silence was oppressive. I walked slowly, the floorboards creaking under my feet, but there was no one there, no signs of life, no disturbance in the dust. I was about to turn back when I noticed something strange in the corner of the room. There, half hidden behind an old chest of drawers, was a small door I had never seen before. It was barely large enough for a person to crawl through, and it looked ancient, the wood warped and rotting. I felt a sense of unease as I approached it, but I couldn't resist the urge to see what was on the other side. I reached out to touch the door, and as my fingers brushed the wood, the footsteps started again, this time, directly behind me. I spun around, my flashlight swinging wildly, but there was no one there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to be right next to me, but I couldn't see a thing. Panic set in, and I backed away from the door, stumbling over the uneven floorboards. The footsteps followed me, relentless, until I was halfway down the stairs. Then, just as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. I ran the rest of the way down, slamming the attic door shut behind me. My hands were shaking as I locked it and leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The footsteps didn't follow me, they stayed in the attic, where they belonged. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was up there, something that had been watching me the whole time. I never went back to the attic after that night. The footsteps would still return, usually late at night, when the building was silent and still. They would pace back and forth, as if someone or something was trapped up there, searching for a way out. I moved out of the apartment a few months later, unable to stand the constant noise and the feeling of being watched. I never found out what was in the attic, and I never wanted to. Some things are better left alone, and the footsteps are one of them. The forgotten doll. When I was a child, I had a doll that I was inseparable from. Her name was Clara, and she was a delicate porcelain doll with a soft, flowing dress and large, glassy eyes that seemed almost lifelike. My grandmother had given her to me on my 5th birthday, and from that moment on, Clara was my constant companion. I would carry her everywhere, talk to her as if she were my best friend, and even insisted that she had her own place at the dinner table. As I grew older, like most children do, I eventually lost interest in my toys. Clara, once the center of my world, was placed on a high shelf in my room and forgotten. Years passed, and the doll collected dust, her once bright eyes dulling and her dress fading with time. It wasn't until I was in my late teens that I rediscovered Clara. My parents were redecorating the house, and I was tasked with cleaning out my old room. As I sorted through boxes of old toys and trinkets, I found her sitting on that high shelf, exactly where I had left her all those years ago. Something about her struck me as odd. Her dress was more tattered than I remembered, and her eyes, though still glossy, seemed to be staring at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just nostalgia playing tricks on me, but the unease lingered. I decided to keep Clara, more out of sentimentality than anything else. I placed her on my dresser in my new room, where she could be a reminder of my childhood. But from the moment she was there, strange things started to happen. At first, it was little things. I would come home to find Clara in a different position than I had left her. Sometimes she would be turned slightly, as if looking in a different direction, or her arms would be in a different pose. I blamed it on my imagination, or perhaps on my younger sibling playing a prank. But then the occurrences became more unsettling. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the feeling of being watched, and my eyes would be drawn to Clara's glassy gaze, which seemed to follow me wherever I went. I would hear soft, almost imperceptible whispers, like the faint rustling of cloth, but whenever I looked around, there was nothing there. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Clara's dress, which had been tattered and faded, now looked as though it had been repaired. The tears were gone, and the fabric seemed brighter, newer, as if someone had been caring for it. I knew for a fact that I hadn't touched the doll since placing her on the dresser. I tried to ignore it, but the fear gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that Clara was somehow changing, becoming more lifelike, more aware. The whispers grew louder, and I began to hear them even during the day, always coming from the direction of the doll. One evening, as I was sitting in my room, I decided to get rid of Clara. I couldn't bear to have her near me any longer. I grabbed the doll and stuffed her into a box, taping it shut and placing it in the attic, far away from my room. I felt a strange mix of relief and guilt, but I was determined to forget about her. That night, I slept soundly for the first time in weeks. But when I woke up the next morning, I found Clara sitting on my dresser, her glassy eyes staring straight at me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had put her in the attic. There was no way she could have returned on her own. I tried to rationalize it, thinking that maybe my sibling had found the box and put the doll back as a joke. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I decided to get rid of Clara for good. I took the doll to the edge of the woods behind our house, dug a deep hole, and buried her there. I covered the spot with leaves and branches, making sure it was well hidden. As I walked back to the house, I felt a strange sense of closure, as if a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. For a while, everything seemed to return to normal. The whispers stopped, and I no longer felt like I was being watched. But a few weeks later, I was walking through the woods with a friend when we stumbled upon a small clearing. There, lying on the ground in the middle of the clearing, was Clara. Her dress was dirt-stained, her porcelain skin cracked, but her eyes were as glossy and intense as ever, staring up at me with a look that I can only describe as knowing. I never touched her again. I turned and ran, leaving her where she lay, and I never went back to that part of the woods. To this day, I don't know how she got out of that grave, or why she seemed so determined to return to me. All I know is that some things are better left forgotten, and Clara was one of them, the intruder in the freezer. I have always loved my work as a graphic designer. I get to create things every day. My office is small and quiet, perfect for focusing on my projects. I usually spend most of my day working on designs for clients, making sure every detail is perfect. I take pride in what I do, and even though it can be exhausting, I always feel satisfied when the day ends. But something changed in me after what happened one night when I came home from work. It was a night that would stay with me forever. It was a Friday evening, and I was ready for the weekend. I left the office around 7 p.m. later than usual, but that wasn't uncommon. The sun had just set, leaving the sky a mix of orange and purple as I drove home. I thought about how I would spend the weekend relaxing. Maybe I'd watch a few movies, order takeout, and unwind. When I got home, I parked my car in the driveway and headed inside. My house is a small one-story place with just enough space for me. I've lived alone here for the past 3 years. It's not in a busy area, which I like because it's quiet, and I can always find peace after a long day at work. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house was dark, just as I expected. I turned on the light in the hallway and kicked off my shoes, enjoying the feeling of finally being home. The familiar scent of the house greeted me, and I felt a sense of comfort. I made my way to the living room and tossed my bag onto the couch. As I walked to the kitchen to grab a drink, something caught my eye. There was a faint light coming from the kitchen. At first, I thought it might be the glow of the streetlights outside, but it was too bright for that. I had made sure to turn off all the lights before leaving for work in the morning, so this didn't make sense. I felt a slight unease, but brushed it off. Maybe I had forgotten to turn off the light. It was a long day at work, after all. But as I approached the kitchen, the unease grew stronger. The light wasn't coming from the ceiling. It was coming from the direction of my refrigerator. I walked into the kitchen slowly, my footsteps soft on the floor. The light was coming from the open door of the freezer. My heart started to race. I was sure I'd closed it. Who would leave a freezer door open? I didn't live with anyone. I was the only one who had a key to the house. Suddenly, the comforting quietness of my home felt eerie. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing in front of the freezer, his back to me. He was dressed in dark, dirty clothes, and his hands were inside the freezer as if he were looking for something. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze in place. This couldn't be real. How could someone be in my house? My mind raced with questions, but there was no time to think. Without making a sound, I slowly backed away from the kitchen. The man hadn't noticed me yet, but I didn't want to take any chances. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. I moved quickly and quietly down the hallway toward my bedroom. Once I was inside, I locked the door behind me, my hands trembling as I turned the key. I stood there for a moment, my back against the door, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind was in a whirl. How did he get in? Why was he messing with my freezer? None of it made any sense. But I couldn't stay frozen in fear. I had to do something. My phone was on the nightstand by my bed. I grabbed it with shaky hands and dialed 911. My voice quivered as I explained the situation to the operator. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. I kept the lights off in my room, afraid that any sign of movement might alert the man that I was there. I didn't know if he was still in the kitchen or if he had heard me leave. Every creak of the house made me jump. The silence was deafening, each second ticking by filled with tension. I tried to listen for any sound, but all I could hear was the rapid beating of my heart. After what felt like forever, I heard the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with fear. What if the man heard them too? What if he tried to escape, or worse, come after me? I couldn't stop my thoughts from spiraling. Finally, I heard the sound of the front door being forced open, followed by heavy footsteps. The police had arrived. I unlocked my bedroom door and slowly opened it, peeking out into the hallway. I could see the beam of a flashlight scanning the walls as the officers searched the house. I stepped into the hallway, relief flooding through me. "I'm here," I called back, my voice shaking. They quickly moved toward me, asking if I was okay and if I had seen the intruder. I explained everything from the light in the kitchen to the man in the freezer. The officers searched every corner of the house, but the man was gone. There was no sign of him, not even a trace that he had been there. The police told me that it wasn't uncommon for burglars to break into homes looking for easy targets. But something about the whole situation felt off. Why was he interested in my freezer? Why didn't he take anything else? I didn't have answers, only questions that haunted me long after that night. I installed security cameras the next day and changed all the locks, but the fear stayed with me. Every time I came home from work, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be inside, waiting. The once comforting silence of my home now felt heavy, filled with the memory of that night. I never saw the man again, but I always wondered who he was, what he wanted. The police never found him, and the case went cold, but for me, the fear never went away. I still love my work, but now, coming home isn't the same. The safety and peace I once felt in my house are gone, replaced by the lingering fear of the unknown. The watcher in the window. It was the summer of 1997, and I was living in a small apartment on the outskirts of a quiet town. The apartment was modest, with just enough space for me and my cat Misty. I was a freelance writer at the time, working from home, which meant I spent a lot of time alone. My days were spent typing away on my old typewriter, while Misty curled up on the windowsill, soaking in the sun. The neighborhood was peaceful, with friendly neighbors who always greeted me with a smile. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. But that all changed one evening in July. It was a warm, breezy night, and I had the windows open to let in the fresh air. The sun had just set, casting a soft orange glow over the horizon. I was sitting at my desk, working on a story, when I noticed Misty acting strangely. She had jumped down from the windowsill and was now staring intently at the window, her fur bristling. I looked over, curious about what had caught her attention, but all I saw was the darkness outside. Misty let out a low growl, something she rarely did, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I got up from my desk and walked over to the window, peering out into the night. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the dimly lit street and the shadows of the trees swaying in the breeze. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure standing on the sidewalk, just outside my apartment. My heart skipped a beat, and I squinted, trying to get a better look. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing. He was standing perfectly still, facing my window, but his face was obscured by the shadows. I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Who was he? Why was he just standing there, staring at my apartment? I watched him for a moment, hoping he would move, walk away, do something, but he didn't. He just stood there, like a statue, his gaze fixed on my window. I quickly closed the curtains, my hands trembling slightly. I told myself it was probably nothing, just someone passing by who happened to stop for a moment. But deep down, I knew something was off. I tried to go back to my work, but I couldn't concentrate. My mind kept drifting back to the figure outside. I could still feel his eyes on me, even though I had closed the curtains. The night dragged on, and I found myself constantly glancing at the window, half expecting to see the figure again. But the curtains remained closed, and the apartment was silent, except for the sound of Misty's occasional growl. Eventually, I decided to call it a night. I turned off the lights, locked all the doors, and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind was racing, and every little noise seemed amplified in the darkness. I kept thinking about the man outside, wondering who he was and what he wanted. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I finally drifted off to sleep. The next day, I tried to shake off the feeling of unease. I went about my routine, working on my stories and taking care of Misty. But I couldn't forget about the figure from the night before. I found myself constantly looking out the window, half expecting to see him again. But the day passed without incident, and by the time evening came, I had convinced myself that it had just been a random passerby, nothing to worry about. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I decided to take one last look out the window, just to be sure. I slowly pulled back the curtains, and my heart nearly stopped. The figure was back, standing in the exact same spot as before, still staring at my window. This time, I could see him more clearly in the dim light. His face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes seemed to be fixed on something inside my apartment. I felt a surge of fear, and I quickly closed the curtains again. My mind was racing. Who was this man, and why was he watching me? I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to call the police, but what would I tell them? That a man was standing outside my apartment, staring at my window. It sounded ridiculous, and I wasn't even sure if it was a crime. But the fear was real, and I knew I couldn't just ignore it. I decided to stay up that night, keeping an eye on the window in case the man tried to do something. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, my heart pounding in my chest. Hours passed, and the figure outside never moved. He just stood there, motionless, his eyes locked on my window. It was as if he was waiting for something, but I had no idea what it could be. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to take its toll, and I found myself dozing off in the chair. When I woke up, it was morning, and the figure was gone. The street was empty, and the sun was shining, but the fear from the night before still lingered. I knew I couldn't stay in the apartment any longer. I packed a bag, grabbed Misty, and left that same day. I moved to a new town, far away from the apartment and the mysterious figure. But even now, years later, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. Every time I look out a window, I half expect to see him standing there, staring back at me.